Hey guys, Uncommon Ramen here with another TCG Tuesday. This is going to be a little bit of a later video as far as posting because I was having a little bit of a hard time figuring out my subject for the video. But today I wanted to talk about a project that I was doing. I started to build with the new Midnight Hunt Innistrad set coming out. I decided that I wanted to build a werewolf commander deck, which I realize in I mean, if you look at it from a detailed point of view, it's not a great concept because werewolves are very difficult to work with as far as their nighttime and daytime mechanic is concerned. And it doesn't look like with Midnight Hunt that that's going to change much. So it's not like it's meant to be a super competitive deck. It's just a for fun tribal deck. But what I ran into while I was building this deck was land base. So we're going to look at this land base here and kind of talk about the pros and cons of what I was running into here. When you are building a commander deck, it's really important to find a way to mana fix the deck if it has multiple colors. And mana fixing is just basically finding lands that can create multiple color mana. In this case, we're looking for red and green. And like I said, it's important to find the lands that you need that can help you mana fix the decks so that you're not so that when you are drawing lands that they're always something that is useful to you. And so here I'm building a two-color deck, red-green, and it is especially important with 3-color decks, 4-color decks, 5-color decks to find these fixes, but with 2-color decks it's a little bit different, and I figured that out obviously just recently while building this deck as far as mana fixing is concerned, because as I was playing it I kind of realized that it wasn't necessarily as huge of an effort to need to mana fix. It's not nearly as bad to stick with basic lands in a 2-color deck, just simply because it only has 2 colors. So that being said, I wanted to look at like I said, the mana base that I picked for this and kind of talk about, again, the pros and cons of this. So we're going to take a look at what we have here. So there are a ton of different red-green mana base or mana fixing lands out there. As you can see right here, and we'll go into these in more detail. The only one I'm missing here, and I do have it, I just didn't feel like putting it in the deck, was the Modal double-sided land, the I want to say Branch Loft, but I'm most likely wrong on that one, because I didn't see any need for it. And actually, the more I go through this mana base and I think about the pros and cons, the more I realize that it's probably the Modal double-sided would have been a better choice in this, just simply because of for a lot of reasons. But anyway, we started out here with the Wooded Foothills, the Fetchland for red-green. Now, if you're running like a high-end competitive deck, you're going to run every Fetchland that has any color that you're running in it. So if I'm running red-green, then obviously I need to run every Fetchland with red and every Fetchland that fetches green. I think that's overkill. Even in a competitive deck, I do see the merit because you're thinning out your deck of lands. But it also means that you have to be running a lot more basic lands or lands that have land types to them, which we will get to some of the, like this right here. Because this was just kind of a for fun tribal deck, and obviously the archetype isn't super good, I only am running the one Wooded Foothills, and that is just because I happen to have it in my collection. There is no way I would have spent the money on grabbing this Wooded Foothills had I not already had it in the collection. So we have the Fetchland, we have Grove of the Burn Willows, which also you can just tap it for red-green. It doesn't come into play tapped, and if you do tap it for red or green, your opponents gain a life. We have the Lit Thicket that helps you filter inland for greater efficiency. also doesn't come into play tapped. And then we have Karpluson Forest, which is the red-green pain land. When you tap it for red or green, it deals 1 damage to you. And it does not come into play tapped. And then we move into the conditional lands, starting with Copperline Gorge, which is the fast land. So it comes into play tapped unless you control 2 or fewer lands. So the less amount of lands you have in play at the time that you play Copperline, the better. And it does tap for red and green as well. We're running the Cinderglade. Cinderglade enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more lands. So it is it's what they call a check land, and it's the exact opposite of the Copperline Gorge. The big difference here is that Cinderglade counts as a mountain or forest. So in the case of the wooded foothills and several other fetch related spells, this guy counts. And then next up, we have the Stomping Grounds. Stomping Grounds is, if you're running red-green, it's a must-have. It comes into play untapped if you pay 2 life. It taps for red and green, and it counts as a mountain or forest. So it's right up there with this guy in terms of how efficient it is in this particular deck. Then we have the Rootbound Crag. Rootbound Crag enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a mountain or a forest. So another type of check land that creates red-green, with the downside being that it is just a non-basic land that does not count as a mountain or forest. So really the only benefit here is that it can come into play untapped, and it creates both types of mana. Followed by Game Trail, which is same in the sense that it creates red-green and it doesn't count as either a forest or mountain. But in this case, instead of checking to see if you have a basic forest or mountain in play, you're going to reveal one from your hand. And that is kind of a drawback because, you have to. That means that you have to be holding on to your mountains or forests. Which is why when I was playing this land, I had intended on running a lot of non-basic lands. So I was kind of hoping that I would be holding on to the, mountains and forests, and I found myself more often than not, really just not holding on to any lands at all. So Game Trail is kind of, you have to get it early game like the fast land, otherwise it is almost likely to come into play tapped. Then moving on, we have Spire Garden. Spire Garden is part of the cycle of Crowdlands, and they're called Crowdlands because they enter the battlefield untapped as long as you have 2 or more opponents. So this is a key card in commander games where you're not doing one-on-one. So big group commander games, that's where this guy comes in, and in commander, this is pretty much a staple. So if I was going to run red-green, this one would be pretty much guaranteed. Then we have what they call the bicycle land or bicycle land because it's a 2-color land that you can cycle. This starts into the lands that come into play tapped with no chance of coming to play untapped unless another card allows for that to happen. The upside to the bicycle land is that, first off, you can cycle it. So if you don't necessarily need that land, you can cycle it to draw a card. The second part being that it counts as a mountain or forest. So this can be fetched out with a fetch land or several different fetch spells. So it has its upside, but really, honestly, when it's put next to something like Cinderglade or Stomping Ground, it's really just not. It's just not as good. So it's kind of it's still got its upside, being that it's a mountain forest, but I don't know if it's worth it. And this was part of where I'm coming in on the pros and cons here. The next one up, we have Temple of Abandon. And this one, I don't know if I should even have kept in here. This one I should have probably just downright gotten rid of. Temple of Abandon is essentially a tap land that creates red-green. with the upside being that when it comes into play, you can scry. It's almost no better than like Kazandu Refuge, I think is what it's called, the tap land that when it comes into play you gain a life. With the difference being, in this case you scry, and in the other one you gain a life. And obviously scrying is better, but does it make up for the fact that this land is just plain slow? I don't know. And especially, again, it's a dual color deck, so you may just not need it. And then the last one is Raging Ravine. It comes into play tapped, it creates red-green, and its real upside here is that you can turn it into a creature until end of turn, but even that isn't a huge upside. I think the biggest upside for this one is that when it attacks, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and that +1/+1 counter is going to stay on it regardless of the fact that it's going to turn back into a land at the end of the turn. So it's a land that when it continues to turn into a creature, it's going to continuously grow in power, and that's what drew me to it in the first place. But after having played a couple of times with this deck, it's just not necessarily what I need for the theme, and it really wasn't paying out in a way that was effective to me. So this is another one of those, because it comes into play tapped, it may just end up getting cut out of the deck for some basic lands because they don't come into play tapped, or even for the Modal double-sided land. So really what I wanted to go into is why I had this challenge. First off, the biggest reason is the tap lands. Almost none of these really warrant being in the deck, especially considering that it's a werewolf theme. The Raging Ravine doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. The Temple of Abandon is just plain too slow. If I don't get it in the first 2 turns, then I don't necessarily want to play it at the later mid to late game. And then the Sheltered Thicket is only useful to me if I'm fetching it out with a spell that forces that fetched land to come into play tapped. So these kind of slowed me down. But then when we talk about the lands that can potentially come into play untapped, really the biggest hits here were the Stomping Ground, the Cinderglade, and the Spire Garden, where the remaining, the Copperline Gorge, the Rootbound Crag, and the Game Trail, they kind of just, they weren't necessary, again, because a forest and a mountain is going to come into play untapped anyway, and so, you know, do I need that many mana fixes in this deck? And that's kind of where the con is that because it's only 2 colors, it doesn't necessarily need that much mana fixing. And because we're playing Commander, we're also going to be playing a lot of artifact mana in the form of Soul Ring and Thought Vessel and, you know, mana rocks like that. But then on top of that, and I think the biggest point here is that because I'm playing green, I'm also playing a lot of ramp spells, and the ramp spells a lot of the time target basic lands, and these don't count as basic lands. And even in that case, when they do fetch non-basic lands, they need to be non-basic lands with land types. So, you know, Stomping Ground, Cinderglade, and the Sheltered Thicket, whereas the Copperline Gorge, the Rootbound Crag, and the Game Trail don't have land types, and therefore are just slower by comparison. So, you know, things like this one makes sense because you're going to have multiple opponents, and these 2 made sense because they are mountains and forests. The remaining 3, they're going to have a lot of fighting to do. The Copperline Gorge is great in the beginning, and the Rootbound Crag, the Game Trail is great in a later game, but at the end of the day, is it warranted when, again, you have the final 4, which are all 4 lands that create the red-green mana that I need, and also just plain don't come into play untapped. So let's talk about these 4 cards. Specifically, we have the Karpluson Forest, which doesn't come into play tapped. You can tap it for colorless, so if you just don't need it for red-green, you don't have to tap it for red-green. And when you do tap it for red-green, it deals 1 damage to you. That's not a huge downside in Commander. We have 40 life, and you should be utilizing your life as a currency in this game. So, you know, tapping for red-green in the early game and dealing damage to you is not a big deal. And in the late game, you're not going to need the mana anymore to fix, so you can just tap it for colorless. Next up, we have the Grove of Burn Willows, which is the exact opposite of the Painland in the sense that when you tap it, instead of taking damage, your opponents gain a life. Again, that's not a huge downside. It's almost a war of attrition at that point, and if you're playing with a deck that's dealing enough damage through the mid and late game, that life gain is trivial, to say the least. So, and again, it comes into play untapped, and also, as you start getting into late game and stop needing mana fixing, you can just tap it for colorless with no downside at all. So these two, you would have to run these right next to the Spire Garden, just because they are just downright good. And regardless of the fact that, you know, neither of them have any land types to them, they're just staples. Okay, so that moves me into the Lit Thicket. Lit Thicket is another one that does not come into play untapped, or it does come into play untapped. You do not need to tap it for colored mana at all. You can tap it for just colorless mana, so if you don't need fixing anymore, this guy is perfectly capable of just being whatever you need it to be. But on top of that, you can tap a red or a green and this land to create double red, red-green, or green-green. And that's important for me because if this is the land I have and the first land that I dropped was a mountain and I needed forests, well, this guy can do it. So it's a great early game fixer, and while it doesn't necessarily accelerate the deck because it's literally just filtering, it does fix a lot of early game problems. So this is just a really great card to have in a red-green deck. And then finally you have the Wooded Foothills, the Fetchland. The Fetchland is just as simple as that. You can search for a forest or a mountain, and it does not have to be a basic forest or mountain. So you can search out your Stomping Grounds, you can search out your Thicket, you can search out your what was the other one? I can't remember. Oh, Cinderglade. You can search out your Cinderglade. Meanwhile, if you already have those lands in play, you could just search out a basic forest or a basic mountain. So we're taking a card out of the deck, which is thinning the deck, and we're getting the mana that we need to fix our mana base. And you're doing all of that for 1 life. And again, we're in Commander where you have 40. So it's not a big deal. It's actually pretty nice. So I think where I'm coming from here, and this is where we're going to go from the pros and cons thing, is that I went through the trouble of getting this huge mana fix base for a 2-color deck, and as I played it, I realized that, you know, beyond turn 5, turn 6, you really don't need to fix that much in terms of color in a 2-color deck because there's only 2 colors. So that was a big mistake on my part. Fortunately, nearly all of these lands were already part of my collection, so I didn't really spend a whole lot of money on it. But at the same time, what I started to realize is that there are just some staple cards like the Wooded Foothills, the Lit Thicket, the Grove of Burn Willows, and the Karpluson Forest. You know, the Copperline Gorge is okay, but really the Stomping Grounds and the Cinderglade and the Spire Garden. And then the rest of it was just kind of, there's no point to it. This is probably, what is this, 7 lands right here? These 7 lands are probably all the fixing you need. With the exception, of course, that you're looking at 100 cards and you have to be able to draw them, which is why, you know, I had all these other lands. But really, I was hardly ever in a position where my mana base was so messed up that I wasn't able to fix it with, you know, the 1 or 2 dual lands that I ended up picking up. So, downside, 2-color deck doesn't necessarily need a huge amount of mana fixing lands. Upside is that regardless, they all have some part of their, you know, card text that makes them good. The Raging Ravine turns into a huge creature. You get to scry, you can cycle, it comes into play early game really well. Check lands are just generally fast. You know, land types. So that's, I just wanted to share that revelation. When you're building for Commander, this is my second Commander deck that I'm building, and you know, it's a learning process all the way through. You don't need to go 0 to 60 on a land base. So search out, you know, the 7 to 8 lands that really benefit your deck. And if you are running, you know, the common and uncommon tap lands, then yeah, maybe you should switch those out for some of these that have a chance to come into play untapped, or if they do come into play tapped, tend to have a better ability on them that makes them more worth it than the common and uncommon tap lands. But to be honest with you, things like Command Tower, Path to Ancestry, and cards like that also help with mana fixing, because they create mana of any color generally, and you can usually find several other lands that create any color that are still better than some of these lands that only create 2, and you know, it's probably a better option in that case. So that is my piece on mana fixing and what I discovered as far as Commander is concerned. If you guys like the video, please like and subscribe, and feel free to leave some comments down below. I will be removing any toxic comments or any comments that are just downright mean. That being said, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this whole process of lands and what little things you discovered while building your Commander decks. And, you know, if you like the video, please like and subscribe. And, yeah, until next time, guys. Peace.